It was a chilly evening in the heart of winter, and the streets were unusually quiet. The kind of silence that wrapped itself around the town, making every sound feel amplified. The distant hum of streetlights, the faint rustle of dry leaves carried by the wind. My shift at Tony's Pizzeria was about to begin, and as always, I arrived early, relishing the few minutes of calm before the dinner rush. Tony's wasn't much to look at. A small corner joint with faded red awnings and a hand-painted sign that read, "Best Pizza in Town." The neon open sign buzzed faintly, its glow reflecting on the frost-covered windows. Inside, the warm aroma of melted cheese and freshly baked dough greeted me, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. I tied my apron and stepped behind the counter, where the pizza ovens radiated comforting heat. Maria, my coworker, was kneading dough with practiced ease. "Evening, Jacob," she said without looking up. "Evening," I replied, checking the delivery board. "Only a few orders so far, typical for a Wednesday night." Maria chuckled softly. "Looks like an easy shift. Maybe we'll actually close on time tonight." I smiled but didn't respond. Closing on time was a rarity at Tony's. There was always a last-minute order or a late-night walk-in. As the evening wore on, the orders trickled in steadily. I loaded my car with pizzas, the scent of garlic and oregano filling the air as I navigated the familiar streets. Most of the deliveries were routine, houses I'd been to dozens of times, customers who tipped just enough to keep me polite but not enthusiastic. It wasn't until my last delivery of the night that something felt off. The ticket was handwritten, not printed from the usual system. It read, "Midnight Special, Extra Sauce, 173, Willow Lane." I frowned. The name and address didn't ring any bells, and the handwriting was barely legible. "Hey, Maria," I called out, holding up the ticket. "Do we even have a midnight special on the menu?" Maria looked up, wiping flour from her hands. "Not that I know of. Must be one of Tony's old regulars. He used to make all kinds of custom orders back in the day." Shrugging, I slid the pizza into its insulated bag and grabbed my keys. The address wasn't far, but Willow Lane wasn't a street I visited often. It was tucked away on the edge of town, where the houses were older and the streetlights sparse. The drive was uneventful until I turned onto Willow Lane. The road was narrow, lined with towering oak trees, whose gnarled branches formed a canopy overhead. The houses here were large but aged, their once grand exteriors now weathered and shadowed. Oh, I slowed as I approached 173. The house was a Victorian-style structure, its paint peeling and windows dark. A single porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the cracked steps. I parked and grabbed the pizza, hesitating for a moment before stepping out into the cold. The air felt heavier here, as though the silence carried weight. I climbed the steps, the wood creaking beneath my boots, and rang the doorbell. Nothing. I waited, glancing around. The street was empty, the neighboring houses dark. I rang the bell again, this time noticing how faint and muffled it sounded, as if the house were swallowing the noise. Finally, the door creaked open a few inches. A pair of eyes peeked out, shadowed and wary. "You're late," a voice rasped. Sorry about that," I stammered. "Here's your pizza." The door opened wider, revealing a man in his 60s, his frame thin and his posture hunched. He wore a faded robe, and his skin looked almost translucent in the dim light. He reached out with a trembling hand, and for a moment I thought he might drop the pizza. "Extra sauce, just like you asked," I said, trying to sound cheerful. The man nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Good. Very good." He handed me a wad of cash, more than double the usual amount. "Keep the change," he muttered, before retreating into the house and closing the door without another word. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but the windows of 173 Willow Lane remained dark. I started the engine and drove away, the unease following me like a shadow. Something about that house, that man, felt wrong. But it was just another delivery, I told myself. Nothing more. Still, as I pulled into my driveway later that night, I found myself locking the door twice. The next few days passed without incident, and life returned to its usual rhythm. But I couldn't shake the odd feeling I had from that delivery. The way the man had answered the door, his strange smile, and the oppressive silence of Willow Lane, it all lingered in my mind like an unwelcome guest. It was late Thursday night when I received another order for 173 Willow Lane. This time the ticket was identical. Midnight Special. Extra sauce. 173 Willow Lane. I stared at the order for a long moment, my heart beating a little faster than usual. Was this a coincidence? Or had the man intentionally requested me again? Should the man be in custody? "Hey, Maria," I called over to her as she was arranging fresh dough on the counter. "I've got another one for Willow Lane. Same deal as last time." She glanced up, her eyebrows furrowing. "The same place? That's weird. I thought they only ordered once in a while. Are you sure it's the same guy?" I nodded, swallowing the unease that was creeping back. "Yeah, the same order. Midnight Special, extra sauce." Maria shook her head, a bemused look on her face. "Well, I guess it's your turn again, but something about that place gives me the creeps." Her words came out in a whisper. Mary grinned. I smiled weakly. "Yeah, me too." I grabbed the pizza and headed out the door, trying to push the unsettling thoughts aside. The drive to Willow Lane was quieter than the night before. The street was as dark as I remembered, the houses standing like silent sentinels along the road. When I reached 173, my stomach twisted in anticipation. The house looked the same as before, dilapidated, abandoned almost. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long twisted shadows. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. Whatever had transpired happened in less time and more slowly. I watched it. As I approached the front door, the silence was even more pronounced, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I rang the doorbell again, feeling a sense of dread creeping up my spine. This time, the door opened faster. The same man stood there, his face more gaunt than I remembered. His eyes, wide and hollow, seemed to absorb the dim light around him. There was a faint smell of something sour, like rotten food or decay, emanating from inside the house. "Extra sauce," he rasped, holding out a hand. I handed him the pizza, but this time he didn't seem eager to take it. His gaze lingered on me for a moment too long, making me feel uncomfortable. His lips twitched, but no smile appeared. "You're the same boy from last time," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm the delivery guy. You, ordered again." The man nodded, his eyes narrowing. "You should be careful." I blinked, not understanding. "Careful?" His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. I felt a chill run down my spine. I don't understand." But the man didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back into the darkness of the house, the door creaking shut behind him. Alex held a breath. I stood frozen for a moment, the words echoing in my mind. "It's never just pizza." My hands trembled as I turned and walked back to my car, my breath coming in short bursts. The feeling of being watched returned. and this time, it was more intense. It felt as though someone, was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to leave. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away quickly, my eyes constantly darting to the rear-view mirror. The house was still there, dark and imposing, but I didn't look back again. When I arrived home, I locked the door and checked the windows twice. Something was wrong with that house, with that man, and with the orders. I couldn't explain it, but I knew deep down that I hadn't just delivered pizza. There was something else, something far more sinister, and it wasn't over. The next night, I was dreading the possibility of another late-night order to 173 Willow Lane. The tension in my chest had only grown since the last delivery. The man's words, his hollow gaze, and that strange warning lingered in my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. When the phone rang at the pizzeria, I was almost certain it would be another order from Willow Lane. Echoed pizza. Maria speaking, she answered. I leaned against the counter, hoping for a break. We've got an order for 173 Willow Lane, she said, looking over at me. It's for you, Mark. I swallowed hard. Are you serious? She raised an eyebrow. You've got to be kidding me. Same guy? I nodded, feeling a mix of dread and frustration building up. Yeah, same place, same order. Maria's expression softened. You know, you don't have to do this. I can take it if you're not up for it. I shook my head. No, it's fine. I'll do it. The words felt hollow. The thought of facing that house again, of seeing that man's strange, unnerving face, made my stomach churn. But I didn't want to seem weak, so I grabbed the pizza, ignoring the nagging voice in the back of my mind telling me to stay away. The drive was even worse this time. The air was colder, the street darker, and the trees lining the road seemed to bend inwards, as if they were closing in on me. Every street lamp flickered as I passed, casting long, jagged shadows that danced like specters. When I reached 173 Willow Lane, the house looked even more decrepit than before. The porch light was out now, leaving the front of the house in complete darkness. A shiver ran down my spine as I parked and got out of the car, the eerie silence pressing down on me. I hesitated at the door, my hand trembling as I rang the bell. The door opened almost immediately, the same man standing in the doorway, his pale face framed by the shadows of the house. He looked different now, more gaunt, his eyes sunk in deeper into his skull, and his mouth slightly ajar as if he were waiting for something to speak. Extra sauce, he whispered, his voice rasping with something more than just hunger. I handed him the pizza, but this time I couldn't bring myself to leave without saying something. I don't understand, I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound confident. What did you mean when you said it's never just pizza? The man's lips curled into something that resembled a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stepped aside, his gaze never leaving mine. You're curious, aren't you? You want to know what's really going on. I nodded, my throat dry. I don't know what you mean. What's happening here? He leaned closer, his breath cold against my skin. There's something in the sauce, something you can't see, but you'll feel it. Everyone does. My heart raced, the weight of his words sinking in like a stone. I took a step back, suddenly desperate to leave, but the man didn't let me go. You'll understand soon enough, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The sauce is just the beginning. I turned and bolted for my car, not daring to look back. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from Willow Lane. No wonder sleep. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, his hollow eyes, and that chilling smile. And the words he had spoken haunted me, echoing through my thoughts. Something in the sauce. What did he mean? What was I really delivering? The way, as I didn't know if I was just imagining things or if something far darker was at play. But I knew one thing for sure. I had to find out. I couldn't stop now. But I wasn't sure if I was ready for what I would uncover. The following days passed in a haze, my mind trapped in the unnerving memory of the man at 173 Willow Lane. His words gnawed at me, each time more vivid and disturbing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was unfolding, and I was caught right in the middle of it. I tried to go back to my usual routine at the pizzeria, but I couldn't concentrate. Every time the phone rang, my stomach dropped. Every knock at the door felt like a shadow lurking just behind me. I was consumed with the thought of that house, that man, and the mysterious sauce. The door faced out on the street, and trembling shadows floated past my eyes. It was a Thursday night when it happened again. The phone rang, and I froze. "Echo Pizza, Maria speaking," she said. I held my breath, already knowing what was coming. "Mark, it's for you," she said, almost as if she'd been expecting it. She hesitated. I could hear the tension in her voice. "It's Willow Lane, isn't it?" She didn't answer, just passed me the phone. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hello," Matt said. "Shame on Vera for saying that," he said and nodded. 173 Willow Lane, came the raspy voice. Same order, same sauce. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. "I will be right there." Maria watched me with concern, but I didn't have time to explain. I grabbed the pizza, my hands shaking as I did. This time, as I drove down the darkened road, the feeling of dread was almost suffocating. The trees seemed to press closer together, and the shadows in the corners of my eyes seemed to move. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but the road behind was empty, as always. When I arrived at 173 Willow Lane, the house was as silent and foreboding as ever. The porch light flickered erratically, casting brief flashes of light that made the house look like it was alive, breathing in the darkness. I approached the door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The man opened the door almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. His eyes, sunken and hollow, met mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "Wait," laughed Firstkin. "Extra sauce," he whispered, his voice as hollow as his eyes. I handed him the pizza, trying to keep my hands steady, but I couldn't help the tremor that ran through me. He stepped aside, but this time I didn't wait for him to speak. I couldn't. The questions burned too brightly in my mind. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What's in the sauce?" He looked at me for a long moment, as if deciding whether to answer. Then, his lips parted in that eerie smile again. "You've felt it, haven't you?" he said softly. "The sauce isn't just food. It's a doorway. Watch for it," he whispered. "It'll happen again." I stepped back, confused and terrified. A doorway to what? The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too unnatural. "To what's always been here. What's been waiting." I felt a cold crawling sensation at the back of my neck, and I knew I needed to leave. But before I could turn to go, he reached out and grabbed my wrist, his grip unnaturally strong. "Don't go yet," he said, his voice low. "You're already a part of it. You just don't know it yet." I yanked my arm free, stumbling back. "I don't know what you're talking about." But the man's expression never wavered. "You will. Soon enough." I ran, almost tripping as I hurried to my car, my breath ragged and heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back as I sped away from Willow Lane, the man's cryptic words echoing in my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his unnatural smile, and I heard his voice. The sauce isn't just food, it's a doorway. What did that even mean? A doorway to what? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like something was creeping up behind me, just out of sight. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going like this. The next morning I went to the pizzeria, hoping that maybe the normalcy of it would calm me down. But as I stepped through the door, I saw Maria talking to a customer. She looked up at me, her face pale. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There's something strange going on with those orders, Mark. Have you heard about the others?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" Maria glanced around, then leaned in closer. "There have been a few complaints about people getting sick after eating the pizza. They say it's not just the sauce, it's like it's messing with their heads." "Am I wrong?" "Exercise helps," I said, forming words out of thoughts. I felt my stomach twist. "What are you talking about?" Maria hesitated again, her eyes darting nervously. "People are saying it's like they can't remember things, or they're seeing things that aren't there. It's happening more and more, and I think it's connected to those orders." I felt the weight of her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had to know the truth. I had to find out what was really going on with 173 Willow Lane and that damned sauce. I stepped toward her, and without thinking, her boyfriend simply stepped back from me. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized I might not be able to escape it. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Every time I closed my eyes, the man's face appeared, his hollow eyes and that unsettling smile. But it wasn't just his image that haunted me. It was the nagging thought that there was something far more sinister at play than I had ever imagined. Maria's warning kept echoing in my mind. People were getting sick, and it was tied to those strange orders from 173 Willow Lane. I couldn't just sit back and let it go on. I had to find out more, even if it meant going back to that cursed house. It was late on a Friday when I made my decision. I had to go there again. I had to confront whatever was lurking behind those walls, no matter how terrified I was. I couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something far worse was happening than I could comprehend. I left the pizzeria as soon as my shift ended, the cool night air doing little to ease the unease settling in my chest. The drive to Willow Lane felt different this time. The streets seemed darker, more oppressive, as if the world itself was closing in on me. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it only intensified with every mile. When I reached 173 Willow Lane, the house stood there, as foreboding as ever. The porch light flickered erratically, casting brief flashes of light that made the house appear as if it were breathing. I approached the door, my heart hammering in my chest. This time, I wasn't going to back down. I had to know what was really going on. The man answered the door almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for me. His eyes met mine with that same hollow intensity. But this time I wasn't afraid. I was angry. Angry at the lies, angry at the fear he had instilled in me. "I need answers," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and fear. "What's going on here? What's in the sauce?" The man didn't speak right away. Instead, he just stared at me, as if studying me. Then, he stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. "I'll show you," he said softly. I hesitated, but curiosity and a need for closure pushed me forward. I stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the air thick with an unsettling chill. The man led me down a narrow corridor, and I couldn't help but notice the strange paintings on the walls. They were all distorted, as if the figures in them were slowly decaying, their eyes wide with fear. We stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway. The man opened it, revealing a small, dimly lit room. At the center of the room was a large, rusted metal cauldron, steam rising from it in faint tendrils. The smell hit me immediately, something rancid, yet oddly familiar. It was the sauce. "Come closer," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped forward, the scent growing stronger as I approached the cauldron. There, floating in the thick, bubbling sauce, were eyes, dozens of them. I recoiled in horror, my stomach lurching. "What the hell is this?" The man's lips curled into that same eerie smile. "This is the sauce's true form, the one you can't see when it's served on a pizza, but it's always been there. Always." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This sauce, it's not just food. It's a conduit, a gateway to something ancient, something that has been waiting, trapped, for centuries. And now, it's starting to wake up." I backed away, my breath quickening. This is insane. You're telling me that this sauce is some kind of doorway?" The man nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "Yes. And now, you've tasted it. You've been marked. You're part of it now, whether you want to be or not." "What's the difference?" I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. My vision blurred, and for a moment I couldn't tell if the room was spinning or if the walls were closing in on me. I grabbed the door frame to steady myself, but the man's voice cut through the fog in my mind. "You can't escape it," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "The sauce is already inside you. You've seen it. You've smelled it. You've touched it. It's a part of you now." I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. My mind raced, but I couldn't think straight. I was trapped in a nightmare, and I had no idea how to wake up. "Summon me," he told the crowd helplessly. I turned and ran, my legs shaky as I fled down the hallway. I burst through the front door, the cold night air slapping my face, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to get away from that house, from that man, from whatever evil was lurking behind those walls. I drove away in a panic, not caring where I was going, just needing to escape. But even as I sped down the road, I could feel it. The sauce. It was inside me now, and no matter how far I ran, it would never let me go. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and terror. The world felt different now, as if something unseen was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the sauce, the swirling, bubbling mass, filled with those unblinking eyes staring back at me. And with each passing day, the sensation of being marked, of being bound to something dark and ancient, only grew stronger. I tried to live my life, to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. The sauce had gotten under my skin, into my mind. It wasn't just in my body. It was in my thoughts, my dreams. I could hear it calling to me, beckoning me to return to that house, to face what I had run from. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't escape the pull. It was like a whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to go back, to confront the man, to understand what was happening. The nightmares had become more vivid, more real. The eyes in the sauce weren't just watching me anymore. They were following me, appearing in mirrors, in reflections, in the shadows of my room. And then there were the dreams. Always the same. always with the man standing there, his smile wider than before, his eyes darker. It was one night, after another restless sleep, when I finally decided to go back. I couldn't take the torment anymore. I had to know the truth, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. I drove to Willow Lane again, the night air colder than it had been before, the streets more deserted. When I reached the house, it stood silent and foreboding, just as it had that first night. But this time, the porch light wasn't flickering. It was completely dark. I stepped out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked up the front steps. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. Without thinking, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was different now. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I made my way down the same narrow hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The paintings on the walls were even more grotesque now, their faces twisted in agony. The house felt alive, as if it were waiting for me. I reached the door at the end of the hallway. The same door, the same room. But when I opened it, there was no cauldron, no bubbling sauce. Just emptiness. Confusion flooded my mind. Had it all been a hallucination? Had I imagined the sauce, the eyes, the man? But then I saw it, a single small bowl sitting in the center of the room. It was filled with a deep crimson liquid. The sauce. I walked toward it, drawn by an irresistible force. I couldn't stop myself. The scent hit me again, rancid, yet oddly familiar. The sauce. It was calling me. I reached for the bowl, my hand trembling. As my fingers touched the surface, the room seemed to shudder, the walls vibrating as if they were alive. The air thickened, and I felt a presence behind me, something cold and heavy. Cold. I turned, but there was no one there. The whisper came again. Not in my ears, but inside my mind. You are part of it now. I backed away, my mind racing. The sauce, the man, the eyes. They weren't just some twisted delusion. They were real, and I was tied to them, bound to something ancient and evil, something that could never be escaped. I ran out of the house, the doors slamming shut behind me with a deafening bang. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, speeding down the road, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But even as I drove, I could feel it. The sauce. It was still with me, inside me, watching me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing there, smiling that horrible smile. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me. But the whisper, it didn't stop. It was inside my head, inside my soul, and no matter how far I ran, I knew I would never be free. The sauce had claimed me,